Today I'm going to show you how to install a Paewang dual-modded 360 PS3 PCB with 16-piece wiring quick disconnect set from focusattack.com. You will additionally need a case, buttons, joystick, ball-top joystick harness, and possibly additional wiring quick disconnects. Now, what I want to say about cases is that for all intents and purposes, they are a box which accommodate a joystick and buttons through holes and mounting brackets, and the materials and quality have been known to vary across all spectrums. They can be made out of wood, metal, books, Tupperware, or even just cardboard. Please note that soldering will be required for the installation. If you need to learn how to solder in arcade sticks, then I suggest watching the following video. And while there are a lot of tools used in soldering, the three big things that'll get you by are a soldering iron, solder, and some sort of desoldering instrument. Additionally, I want to mention that this 16-piece wiring quick disconnect set is enough to wire 8 buttons. If you have additional buttons, then you will need to order 2 more per button. For example, my case will be using 10 buttons in total, 6 on the face and 4 on the sides. Then I will require an additional 4 quick disconnects. In total, 20 quick disconnects. They also come with vinyl sleeves to protect and insulate the quick disconnects, but I'm going to start wiring with the 2 white wires. I'm going to begin by soldering the first white wire to the signal point for R1/right bumper. I also prefer relatively thin solder. Generally, the thinnest that you can get at Radio Shack is usually the best whenever you're working at this size. Now what I'm going to do is melt a little bit of solder over the point that I'm going to solder to, like that, if it'll stick. There we go. It'll just be a little metallic dot that will stick on top, and this will be melted again. And once we melt it again, we bring in the wire like this. And after it melts, hold the wire in place, let it cool back down and solidify, and then you've just soldered it on. To test and ensure a good connection, give it a light tug, and it won't break off the board. This means you've soldered it well. Now we're going to solder the other gray wire to a ground point, and we're also going to repeat this with every other color. Now, to show you where a few ground points are, there's one here, 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 there, and on the left side of all of these ones that would normally connect to the joystick. You can see them all on the included diagram. Now I'm just going to use the same exact process of surface mount soldering to connect the other gray wire. So I'm going to melt a little solder over the point until it will stick. Generally, heating up the contact that you're going to solder to helps the solder flow and stick to it better. Flux will also help the solder stick. But I'm just going to do it the old-fashioned way, wait out for a minute, and now I've got some solder stuck to the terminal. I'm going to solder the wire too. And again, we're going to use the same process. We're going to heat up the existing solder until it melts, push the wire into place, remove the soldering iron, hold it in place, wait for a second to let it cool and solidify, and there you go, it's soldered on. And again, we can tug it, and it will be just fine. Now, since I'll be repeating this process on all of the signal points here on the bottom, I'm just going to melt a little bit of solder over each point so I don't have to do it again later. And there you have it. It's prepped and ready to go for the next set of wires. Next up, I will continue on as I've been doing with the red set of wires to connect to the R2/RT button on the Paewang PCB. Again, this is the signal point and not the ground point. So I'm going to repeat the same process as with the white wire, and with my soldering iron, heat it up until the red wire sinks into place. Let it go, let it cool, and there you have it. As always, you can give it a tug to check the security of your soldering. It's a good habit just to check and double check, make sure that nothing is going to come loose from playing. Now, since there are way more signal points than ground points on this, I'm actually going to double up this ground terminal right here and solder the red wire together with the white wire just to create two ground connections to two wires. The ground points aren't really unique, they're all connected to each other in the PCB itself, so even if you soldered to a different point, you'd be connecting it just the same way. Now, you don't have to necessarily do it this way. There are a lot of ways to continue connecting more ground points, such as using a barrier strip or daisy chaining the wires, or a lot of other things that you can do. But this is the best way to do it without any more supplies needed. Now that you're familiar with the process, I'm just going to speed through the rest of this. Again, if you're not exactly sure how I'm doing this, you can just rewind the video and watch it over again. If you ever feel yourself just getting too nervous or frustrated with this, because it can be very nerve-wracking and frustrating, just give yourself a 5-minute break to cool off, get your nerves settled, and come back again. Otherwise, you might cause yourself a few mistakes, like right here, we have a solder bridge. These 2 points are connected when they shouldn't be. Now the quick fix is just to drag your soldering iron across them until they separate out. Then you're good to go and continue soldering. And one thing I've found about soldering irons is that sometimes they have little rubber grips on them very close to the actual heated iron. I don't think that's really the best way to hold it. I think the best way to hold it is really from the back, where it's at the thinnest point. You can hold it much more like a pencil, have a lot more control over it, and it's also cooler, so it won't burn your hands nearly as much. Now, after this, you have all 8 main action buttons soldered on, but there are still 4 more buttons that we need to solder. Now, since I only plan on using the 6 main action buttons for Street Fighter default arcade sticks, I can actually remove the L1 and L2 button signal wires. I don't have to remove the ground because every button needs to have a ground paired with it, so I can leave the yellow and black wires soldered to ground, but on signal, they gotta go. The black wire I just pulled off after melting the solder, but you could alternatively use a desoldering pump, like so, for any mistakes or accidental solderings. Now we're going to be connecting the additional buttons for turbo, start, select, back, and home, and for this I'm going to require the additional 4 wiring quick disconnects. Now for the remaining 4 buttons, it's just kind of a combination of the ground wire soldering and the signal wire soldering. Just solder it to the left side as we've been doing with the ground wires, but this time naturally we're only going to solder 1 wire to each. In this case I'm just using the yellow wire, and the other yellow wire is still connected to ground, as it should be anyways. And I also get the black wire soldered to the back button. Then I use my extra quick disconnects for the back and guide buttons. However, in a lot of arcade sticks, you only have 3 side buttons to use, and a turbo button is required. It's required to actually switch the console that you're using. Whenever you plug the Paewang in, if the turbo button's held down, it'll switch it from the last console that you used. However, to get around this, you can use a small piece of wire and solder it from the back button connection right there, and then solder it to the turbo button connection on the signal sides. Do not use the ground sides because you'll probably get a button held down forever and ever. But doing this little trick will make it so that your back button will also function as the turbo button, so you can hold the back button whenever you want to switch consoles. However, my case has 4 side buttons, so I'll just be using them all. If you don't have any spare wire, you can just take one of the wiring quick disconnects, cut off a piece of it, strip it, and use that instead. And just as before, connect the corresponding green wires to ground. Now, to wire the joystick, we need to take 2 things into consideration. First, we need to take into consideration the direction that your joystick is oriented in. The other thing we need to consider is what type of harness you're actually using. Generally, the most commonly used setup that I've seen, and this is also in Mad Catz sticks, is to have the 5-pin header facing away from the buttons. To figure out the type of harness that you're using, the easiest way is just to look at the 5-pin connector and look at the outermost wires. If one of them is orange, then it is a Seimitsu harness. If one is black, it's a Sanwa harness. This is a Seimitsu harness. Now, use this joystick wiring guide linked in the description to match up what color wire you're going to be using on what terminal on the Paewang. In my case, I'll be using a Seimitsu harness for the top left configuration. Now, I find the amount of stripped wire on the end of the joystick harnesses to be a bit much, so I just trim them down to size using a pair of scissors. This orange wire will be connected to ground. Any of these left points on the sets of 2, the right points are all going to be connected to the rest of the joystick wires. As you can see, I've connected one of the green wires that I intended to be ground from my buttons. Now I'm using the same process as before, just using the existing solder on both the joint and the wire, melting it, letting it go, and it's soldered on. Now, in my orientation and using a Seimitsu harness, I'm going to want to solder the black wire to the left signal terminal. And the left signal point is this very rightmost point, ironically, but just do as we've been doing and solder it here. It's a little bit tougher than the rest of it because you're kind of soldering to a pin instead of soldering to a flat surface, but essentially once you get the hang of it, it shouldn't be that difficult. Next up is the yellow wire, which I'm going to connect to down, followed by the green wire, which I'm going to connect to right. And remember, all of these need to be connected onto the right side of the pair of points. The left side is always ground for these. Now, you'll find it very easy to get solder between these 2 points if you're not very experienced. They're very close together and it's very easy to do. So, the best way to do it is to grab your desoldering pump and heat up the offending solder and suck it away as we've been doing. However, you might not necessarily get it all in a single shot. I in fact didn't. There was a little bit stuck between the 2. It's hard to see on the video, so you'll have to closely look whenever you're doing this yourself. So I just give it a second go, and there's just a little bit left between the 2. I can actually drag my arm between them and separate the offending solder out. Finally, I'll solder the remaining red wire to its up point right there, and all the soldering is now complete. Now at this point your PCB should look like some sort of octopus monster thing with the amount of crazy wires it has hanging off of it. However, you can cut the wires to the size that you like and then solder them on if you prefer. However, this is only really necessary if you want really clean wiring. Installing the buttons is just a simple screw-in process. Pop the button in, screw the nut on, rinse, repeat for all of your buttons. Since the way a joystick is mounted changes from case to case, I really won't go into that. In fact, my case has a Sanwa stick in it, even though it was fitted for a Famitsu stick. The Sanwa stick was all I had on hand with a 5-pin connector. Sanwa joysticks often ship with 2 dust washers. One is generally all that's needed, and you can slide in the shaft cover if you have one. Now, as for the ball top, it will screw in, but to completely tighten it down, you need a large flathead screwdriver in the back, and just twist it while holding the ball top in hand to secure it. And there you have your front panel ready to be wired. Now in our case, we're going to actually install the Paewang. First things first, go ahead and untie your USB cable and slip it through a hole or get it out however your case permits. I know a lot of cases like to use Nutric USB jacks, so you could plug straight into that. But if you're like me and you have a case where the wire simply goes out, I would recommend that you tie a knot in it before it leaves the case. What this will do is whenever the actual USB cable will be pulled or tugged on or whatever happens that there might be some stress, the knot will absorb all the shock so that it doesn't get pulled off of the PCB, which would cause some serious problems. The next easy step is just to plug in the joystick harness into the joystick itself. Everything soldered onto the PCB, if connected correctly, your joystick will work perfectly, no problems. If you have some problems with it, then you will need to switch some of the wires, and we'll get onto that when we get to the troubleshooting section at the end. Now, we're ready to wire up the buttons. The way that I've suggested that you solder, where you solder one of the colored wires to ground and then its matching color to the appropriate signal point, what you're able to do is pick out a pair of the matching color and connect both to a single button, and what that will do will make your button that signal wire's button. Let me just show you with an example. I used the gray wire on the X signal point and the other gray wire on a ground. So this one that I'm connecting is from the signal point. I simply slip it onto the button with the quick disconnect and then slide the vinyl sleeve over it to protect it. Since I'm using a Street Fighter default layout, the first kick button should correspond to X. So therefore, this is why I'm wiring up the pair of gray wires to the one kick button. On this orientation upside down, it looks like the third kick, but remember when you flip it over, it'll actually be the closest to the joystick, so it will be the first kick. Now that I have both of the quick disconnects connected to the button, that button is now wired up and ready to go. All we have to do is repeat the same process with the remaining 9 buttons. One side of the button's terminals will always be connected to ground. It doesn't matter which one, just one needs to be connected to ground. The opposite one needs to be connected to the specific signal wire you want your button to be. For example, this one will be connected to the X button for one punch or light punch. This is why I recommended to solder each pair of wires, one to ground and then the other to the specific signal that you want. This way you can match up the wires. This is also a trick that is done in the Mad Catz Standard and Tournament Edition fight sticks, as well as a lot of other Hori sticks, the Canvas sticks, and a few others. You don't want to necessarily always rely on colors when wiring, but they're a very helpful guide to help you get it right the first time. You also don't necessarily have to wire this to Street Fighter default if you don't want to. The Start, Select, Home, and Turbo buttons are handled in the same manner. Even though the buttons are smaller, the logic is still the same. And finally, when we get the last black wire in place, I'm only going to be left with the 2 sets of green wires. Now, the problem with this is that you can accidentally mix them up, and it would cause these buttons to no longer work. So what I do to avoid confusion is find where it's soldered to the PCB and then follow the wire back to the quick disconnect. In this case, I use the signal wires from each of them, and I connect the specific signal wire I want on that button to the button that I'm going to be using. This way, the only remaining wire is a ground wire, and they are both green. So that way I can just pick and choose whichever green ones that I want and plug them into the other terminal of the button. If you did the little trick where you solder the wire from the turbo spot to the back button spot, then all you have to do is wire up the back button. It'll already be both. You don't have to worry about any ground wires or anything. It'll just be that whenever you push the button down, it'll connect ground to both the back and signal buttons, and the PCB will assume that both are being pressed at the same time. As far as switching out consoles, this is a good thing because you can use one button for 2 purposes, and when you're navigating menus and you use the back button, you don't really have to worry about activating turbo on accident. The way turbo is activated is by holding down the turbo button and the buttons that you want to have going on turbo. So by doing this, you pretty much avoid ever having to use turbo accidentally. If you're a tournament player, you know how bad turbo is, and you will still be able to switch consoles. After connecting all of your buttons, the internal wiring is complete and you're ready to seal up your case. Now you might actually want to save this step for after you've tested it out and made sure that every button is where you want it to be and that the joystick completely works. But you can also seal it up right now if you feel confident or if you just don't want this wiry mess hanging out. I know it isn't the cleanest of projects, but this is generally how first-time wiring looks. Clean wiring is something that just takes practice, skill, and time to do. It also usually costs extra because you have to employ more elements such as tech flex and heat shrink tubing, zip ties, or spiral tubing, whatever works. That's all a matter of preference, and you'll develop a preference if you continue to wire up sticks. But for now, we're just going to go ahead and stuff our mess inside and seal it shut. You can keep this dirty little wiring secret to yourself. No one ever has to see it except for your own 2 eyes. And you can always tell people how great of a stick wire you are with your nice dual modded stick. Now, the best way to actually test this isn't on a console, but actually on a Windows PC. Under the Start menu, you can go under Control Panel, Printers and Other Hardware, and then to the Game Controllers menu. And this will actually show you a very nice menu. It'll also tell you what mode your stick is in. Though it's supposed to be default 360, I actually got mine default PS3. If it says controller for Xbox 360, it's in 360 mode. If it says arcade stick, then it is in PS3 mode. Now, nobody's perfect, and we will always sometimes need to troubleshoot our stick for problems, and that's what this section is for. If your joystick isn't working, then check the connections for the wires connected to the harness and make sure that the harness is plugged in. If it totally isn't working, then make sure that your ground wire is properly connected to a ground spot. If 2 or 3 directions are wrong, then they are probably in the wrong order on the PCB itself. Check the wiring diagram and make sure that everything checks out, or you can just switch around the wires until you get it to work. If your buttons aren't working, then you should check the connection to the broken button back to the PCB and make sure that both connections are soldered on securely. You should also make sure that one of the wires is connected to ground and the other wire is connected to the signal that you want for that specific button. If two buttons are simply switched around, all you have to do is unplug the two wires from the two buttons and then switch them, and then they should be fixed. If you have a button that's being stuck, held down, then likely the problem is a short circuit, and these are usually caused by solder bridges. Make sure that whatever button is being held down, follow back the wire to the PCB and then check for any solder bridges or for some metal that might be accidentally connecting ground to the signal wire. This will likely happen with the joystick directions if you aren't very good at soldering, because again, they are very close and easy to accidentally bridge. If you find your Paewang not switching consoles, then you may just not have the proper connection to the turbo button. Always make sure that you're holding the turbo button down before you connect it to the console or PC. After that, if you use the little trick I showed you, make sure that your back button is working also. If your joystick won't connect at all, the culprit is likely a bad USB connection. It may have snapped in the installation. Just check your USB cable and make sure that everything is firmly connected. If not, you can always repair your USB cable by watching this video.